Hello, Dano-Fanos. Hello, Dano-Fanos. Come in, Dano-Fanos.
Hey everybody, it's Bobby Paul. I am your host here on the Six Strings Under podcast. Today, we are going to sit down with Bryan Peterson of GearSecure.net. We're going to pick Bryan's brain about what pedals he would take on tour if he was limited. And I forgot to ask him what guitar. We're going to go over all the upcoming vintage guitar shows. I'll let you know which ones I'm going to be at. But most importantly, a man by the name of Howard Daniel, son of Nathan Daniel, was kind enough to share a lot of personal stories about his family, both sad and happy. This did end up being a two-part series, and in the first part, we are going to follow the life of Nathan Daniel starting in 1911 through 1958. Part 2 will be 1958 to 1969. And then there is a whole world of stuff that gentleman got involved in when he retired. I mean, when he retired, he started working. And we're going to have some links to that information and more because Howard's one hell of a writer. I dare asked him if he was a English professor. His writing is incredible. But with no further ado, let's kick off this podcast with part 1 of A Danelectro Story, The Adventures of Nathan Daniel.
I'd like to thank you, Howard Daniel, for joining us today and filling us in on the background and the man, Nathan Daniel, your dad.
Well, thank you. Well, first, let me make sure that people who might be listening understand who Nathan Daniel was and who I am. I am Nathan's son. Nathan passed away at the end of 1994. I was about 50 years old at the time. I was born in 1944.
Your dad was 82?
Yes.
You went to Ellis Island recently and looked up your family.
Well, I've always known when my dad was born. I knew his birthday and the year, which was 1912. But when I went to Ellis Island, I tried to look up all my grandparents. My dad's parents came together. They were married, and they basically emigrated from Lithuania, which was then ruled by Tsarist Russia, in 1911 on their honeymoon, as it were. It was not a good time. It was not a good time to be of the Jewish faith in Tsarist Russia. There were it's an English word as well as a Russian word, pogroms, throughout the Tsarist Empire against wherever Jews lived, which is basically only in the western part of European Russia. But there were people, the other people who lived there who were not Jewish, and some of them committed terrible crimes against their Jewish neighbors. They destroyed shops and homes and murdered people, sometimes hundreds of people at a time. These were terrible things, and lots of people from Tsarist Russia emigrated in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They came to the United States, most of them. So all my grandparents were among those. And but I only at Ellis Island, which was the gateway to New York for people who immigrated to the United States through the port of New York, I only found records for my dad's parents, and they came it turns out they came on September 23rd, 1911, which was 1 year exactly to the day before my dad was born. And I don't think my dad was aware of the fact that he was born on the first anniversary of his parents' arrival in the New World, but so it was. When my dad was young, they lived in Harlem. And one of the stories I remember my dad telling about living in Harlem, in New York City in the summer, it can get pretty hot, including during heat wave. It was still hot and unpleasant in the evening. And so people would sometimes choose to sleep outdoors. Some people would sleep on the fire escape to their apartment because they typically lived in multi-story walk-up buildings, 4 or 5 stories up. But my dad and his family sometimes would go, when he was a kid, they would go out to Central Park and spread blankets out on the grass and spend the night sleeping in Central Park, along with lots and lots and lots of their neighbors. He was a character. He had a good sense of humor. played pranks. He played pranks on his two younger sisters. Well, and he was not a good. He was a very smart guy, very smart. But he didn't enjoy school. He didn't do his homework. His parents, who were not literate in English for at least when he was a youngster and going to grade school, they didn't know about homework, or they didn't follow up or anything. He didn't do his homework, but he did very well on tests, and this was true throughout his school career from high school. I recall he told me this story, and at one point when he was getting ready to graduate, and in order to graduate, you had to pass the Regents exam as well as getting passing grades in your classes. There was one math teacher who really did not like my dad because my dad never did the homework. He wanted to flunk my dad, but he couldn't because my dad got a perfect score on the Regents exam in math. That's a story that came down through the family. But my dad was a bit of a prankster and a character. He had a great sense of humor. He was fun to grow up with.
How many brothers and sisters did Nathan have?
He had two sisters. They were both younger than he was. Not much. And actually, his first job was in his bedroom in his parents' apartment when he was a young man, where he first designed or dreamt up interesting circuits, and then he would go take a subway in New York City downtown and buy, transformers and resistors and capacitors and, tubes and everything, and put amplifiers together. And eventually, he sold them.
Was this in the Bronx or the?
I believe I'm not certain. At a certain point, my grandparents moved to the Bronx. Later, they moved outside New York City. They moved out to Long Island, but that I was already a child. But very shortly before the start of World War II, I'm not sure what it was, but as I recall the conversations at home when I was growing up. My dad and Mom saw war looming. Obviously, nobody could have predicted the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the United States was going to get involved in the war that was already raging in Europe and the other war by the allies of Germany and Italy, the two Axis powers in Europe. And their Asian ally, Japan, was waging a terrible war in Asia, mainly in China, and later they took that war to what is now Vietnam. In those days it was called French Indochina, and also to what is now Indonesia. In those days it was called the Dutch East Indies. That was back in colonial times. And so my parents saw war coming, and for whatever reason, I think my dad thought it would be a useful thing to do. He left New York City and took a job with the U.S. Army Signal Corps as a civilian in Monmouth County, New Jersey, a place called Eatontown. The Signal Corps was then headquartered at a military base, which is no longer active, but it was called Fort Monmouth, named for the county. Actually, there was a Battle of Monmouth in the Revolutionary War. In any case, so my dad went to work for the Signal Corps during the war, and he stopped his own business to do that work. And he was doing basically development of one kind of electronic thing or another. He was not working on radar. The particular thing that I know he did, I'm sure he did lots of different kinds of things, but he was put to work on trying to figure out an inexpensive way to keep gasoline engines from emitting electronic interference, from emitting signals that could interfere with radio reception. Because sometimes if, say, a courier on a motorcycle came roaring up to a place where the troops were getting ready to engage the enemy, and somebody was on a walkie-talkie, and this motorcycle or a Jeep came around, it would emit enough static that the transmission was not interrupted, but it became unintelligible. And there was some kind of an expensive way that the manufacturers had of trying to defeat this. But my dad was put to work to find a simpler and much cheaper way of doing it, and he did. I am still a kid, but I asked him, what would you say the result of your work was? And he said, I saved the government $1 million. And in those days, $1 million was worth a little bit more than $1 million. Even $1 million is still $1 million is still not so bad. On that project, he was sent out away from Fort Monmouth. He was sent to work with vehicle manufacturers, with Jeep manufacturers, in Detroit, and motorcycle manufacturers. I think it was a brand of motorcycle, may still be there, called Indian Motorcycles. And so my dad made the Jeeps and the motorcycles that the Army was using. He saw to it that they didn't interfere with radios that the troops were using when they drove up. Actually, at a certain point during the war, he was going to volunteer for the Marine Corps. And his boss at Fort Monmouth and my mom, his wife, talked him out of it. The reason his boss, well, his wife, my mom talked him out of it because she didn't want him going to war. His boss talked him out of it because he was doing much more valuable work than just slinging a gun on the front someplace.
Yeah.
World War II was over. He left the government. He and my mom had already moved to New Jersey, so after he left the Signal Corps, he opened up his business, and nearby, it was in the town of Red Bank, which is basically the next town up from slightly to the north of Eatontown, and Eatontown being the location of Fort Monmouth. And Dad didn't usually refer to it as the factory. He always called it, quote, the shop.
My name's Lou Carlos. I'm a studio producer based in Chicago, and I'm a former music critic of the Chicago Tribune. Now, many people say that it's the effects pedal or the guitar that makes a huge difference. However, the pick is often one of the most underrated aspects of playing. Let's test drive it. Let's see what it can do. Okay, are we kicked on? I can tell you right now from playing this pick, it does a better job of reproducing an old Fender sound and feel in terms of the amplifier than some of the boutique amplifiers that claim to be. Remarkably, you can't see the amp on camera. This is a Marshall. It is not a Fender. This is part of what the pick is doing in terms of the articulation. This is wonderful. This pick has made a believer out of me. I hope it makes a believer out of you. I'm Lou Carloso, Chicago-based record producer. I love it. The Forever Pick. May it live forever.
You can find Forever Pick exclusively on Reverb.com.
Was your dad a vacation guy, or is your dad a nose to the grindstone 52 weeks a year guy?
He was
That's
a busy
wonderful.
guy. The factory was there was a tremendous amount of demand for his instruments. He was not a vacation guy. When I was growing up, and when I was 4 and 5 years old, twice, both those years, we actually took a driving vacation to Florida. Drove down from New Jersey to Florida with my mom and dad and my aunt, my mom's younger sister, who was single at that time. And after that, we took very few vacations. One time in my, I want to say I may have been 10, 12 years old, we took a short time and drove up to the Berkshires in Massachusetts and did some nice things up there in the mountains, and in particular musical things. We went and saw the Boston Symphony Orchestra play in Tanglewood. So that was a vacation we took. But we didn't do many. And the next vacation we took as a family was not until I was in high school, when we went for around Christmas time. Oh, yeah, there were two. One Christmas, I may have been a freshman in high school. One Christmas we went down to Florida for that week or so of vacation, and a year later we went and did something that for us was quite adventurous. We went to Mexico. Subsequently, I have written a few other articles with recollections of this and that about my dad or the factory, and those appear in my blog. And so if you go to my website, and then you go to the navigation inside the website, there's one place. It's called blog. It's very obvious. One category is Danelectro, or Nathan I. Daniel and Danelectro. I've forgotten exactly what it's called. And I think you will find some of those of interest.
Very good.
And so
I'll make those very easy for people to find.
You might want to link to some of those.
Yes, I will. Absolutely. And I did want to, as you mentioned your vacation when you went up north, and one thing that you and your dad shared the love of, do I have it correct that you both love the symphony? You both love?
We both love classical music, and my mom too. My mom used to tune the radio in to one of two stations out of New York City. We were just barely in range of FM radio from New York, where we lived in New Jersey on the coast, or near the coast. And She would always listen to the classical music stations. I grew up with classical music from earliest childhood, and she and my dad enjoyed it too. We would go to concerts, symphony concerts, and piano and violin and quartet recitals and all kinds of stuff. I recall there were 3 places in our neighborhood where we could see things like that, and then also occasionally we saw very interesting cultural stuff in Princeton, which was about an hour's drive to the west of where we lived in New Jersey. And Princeton, of course, being a university town, had some interesting stuff. But
your dad didn't get a lot of time for vacation, but he definitely took in the culture and lived life and didn't let life live him. And I'm glad to hear
you can certainly say that. I know you've said that your work is that of a luthier.
Yes, sir.
And which is fascinating. And my dad never employed a luthier, and he was certainly not a luthier himself. One of the secrets to making his instruments inexpensively, and therefore making them available to youngsters and beginners and people who couldn't afford to lay out hundreds of dollars for a fancy instrument or a brand that people were anxious to have, was the fact that the people he employed were ordinary people who were just looking for a job, who had no previous experience in making amplifiers or guitars at all. They were just people who kind of knew how to use tools and were reasonably bright and could catch on to something quickly. And one of the things that it's not simply my dad's genius was not simply in designing amplifiers and guitars. It was also made manifest in the design. Some of it was made manifest in the design of tools that he created specifically for use in the factory, but also in the way he figured out how to make guitars and amplifiers in a way that anybody who was handy could do, and no one person made the whole thing. No one person made the whole amplifier, no one person made the whole guitar. Unlike, say, the name is a violin maker, Stradivarius, who made the entire violin himself, the neck, the body, everything. My dad broke the manufacture of the various things he produced down into a separate series of relatively small tasks. And people who worked at that factory some of them worked in the wood shop. Some of them worked in the department where they wired together the amplifier chassis. And somebody worked in the place where what he called, there were 2 final assembly areas: final assembly of guitars, where the bodies and the electronics and the necks were all put together, and there was final assembly of amplifiers, where the speakers and the chassis were in effect married together, and it was all put together. So people had very specific jobs. Nobody put an entire amplifier or an entire guitar together. Everybody did their specific area of expertise, and it all got put together in the final assembly areas, and then it finally went to the area where it was packed up and shipped out. In that way, he was able to hire people at a reasonable cost. I think they were relatively well taken care of in terms of wages. Those who went past the first week when they were working at minimum wage. It was basically a friendly place. Everybody called my dad by his first name. They all called him Nat. And I was working in the factory during the summer. And I started when I was 14, which was the earliest you could get a work permit as a youngster in New Jersey, where I grew up.
And your dad gives you the first job of doing what?
The first job, I had a number of jobs. I worked there for several summers while I was in high school and in college. And the first job I had was nailing baffles together. The speakers, in an amplifier cabinet, the speaker is mounted on something called a baffle. And it was 2 pieces of material. One was a big one, flat thing with a hole cut in it that the speaker was mounted against. And then perpendicular to that large piece was another piece that fit into the cabinet in a certain way, and they needed to be nailed together. And so for the first week, I was nailing those 2 pieces of material together with a hammer. hammer and nails. Lots of nails, I don't remember how many nails in each one. It probably varied on the size. For a Twin 12, that is one of the models he made, which had two 12-inch speakers, so the baffle was over 24 inches across. There would have been more nails than in a single speaker model, and especially a model with a smaller than 12-inch speaker. Anyhow, so that's what I was doing in my first week, and long before the end of the first day, the palm of my hands was totally blistered. And my dad's attitude about that was, "It's okay, that's part of the job." I was also working like everybody else in the factory who would be hired, a new hire. I worked for minimum wage. In those days, minimum wage was $1 an hour. And my dad would hire people at minimum wage, give them some job, see how well they did. If they did well, at the end of the first week, usually they would get a significant raise, and as they continued doing well, they would get a series of raises. If they didn't do well, they were let go, sometimes even before the end of the first week. So I was hired at minimum wage, and that's probably all I made throughout that, at least that first year, first summer. And I thought $1 an hour was fabulous money. I mean, I was a 14-year-old kid in 1958. That was real money. I didn't get all of it. Uncle Sam got some of it, but I took home whatever, $36 or ever each week, and I felt like I was swimming in money. I remember the first Saturday after that first work week, my family drove into New York. I'm not sure quite what the purpose of that particular trip was, but my dad suggested that I take my mom out to dinner that evening, and he named a particular restaurant. It was in the theater district, where Broadway musicals and other plays take place. It was a very nice Italian restaurant that people at that time knew about. I believe it's no longer in operation, called Mama Leone's. And when my dad suggested I take my mom for dinner there, I knew enough to figure out that was going to basically eat up the entire paycheck. And I don't know if it was the look on my face or I said something, and he said, "That's okay. It'll teach you the value of $1." And it did.
You had the greatest dinner. So that was 1958. You got $36 in your pocket. You probably had enough money in your pocket with tax to go to Sears and buy a Silvertone guitar.
Yeah, I wouldn't. My dad was generous. He brought a guitar home.
We're here with Bryan Peterson from GearSecure.net. Bryan, if you were going on tour, your tour manager handed you a box and said you can only bring 3 pedals on tour with you, playing guitar, what 3 would you bring?
Okay, so that to me is like, I'm known for like running 18 pedals, so when you say I'm going to have to scale down just a little bit, I don't think you realize how much I actually have to scale down. So, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
But I think it's doable. So if I'm playing guitar, I'm thinking that my main tones generally are going to come from my distortions and my overdrives, right? That's going to be kind of my signature tones. And I want something that's going to be flexible enough for me to use. I have a Marshall Governor, old Marshall Governor, not the GV2, the original one. And that thing, like, no matter what guitar or amp I'm playing, I can get a lot out of it, a wide range, and I've always loved that one. But I think it's also very amp-like, and sometimes I'd really like to have something kind of like a separate channel in a way for that, so I'd probably throw an overdrive in front of it, like an OCD or something like that. That way I'd have my governor tone, my OCD tone, and then the combined tone. So I'd have like 3 different distortion overdrive tones.
And you gave up 2 spots.
I gave up 2 slots just for drives.
Wow.
And then, I love my modulation effects and my delay effects. What I would probably do is pick a delay, because I can do a short slapback or turn that delay almost into a reverb. So I could get 2 or 3 things there. I have an old Deluxe Memory Man. That would likely be the choice, although I also have, because that's a giant and kind of fragile housing, I might just go with, I have an older DoD digital delay
Really?
That would be pretty straightforward and good to use on that too.
Really? You like that old delay?
I like it.
Excellent. I got to give it a revisit then.
I like it better than the current Boss stuff. I think the tone on it is better than that. Yeah.
I overlooked it as a kid because I think I had a bad experience with a distortion pedal. Like, I didn't really like the tone on
for DoD.
Yeah. And then I kind of walked away.
They have a ton of really good pedals from that early, into the early 90s kind of period, 80s to early 90s. And then they were part of Digitech and they got kind of forgotten.
Yeah. As Digitech came up and got more prominent in people's faces when they walked into the music store.
But as I got started playing, they were more of the primary competitor for Boss. And they were a little bit cheaper.
Yeah.
But now when I sit there and listen to it, I really like the tone of it. And like I have their wah pedal, I have a few others from them that I really like as well.
Footloose, the original Footloose movie, reads awful today. Great movie back then, right?
Yeah.
Good. And then, so this would be the opposite. Dodd wasn't hitting the spot then, but if we revisit it, we might find a new love in Dodd.
I think you will. There's a few distortions and overdrives that are great. And then the Gonculator is a classic. Their envelope filter is one of the best envelope filters you're going to find. And it was always a really cheap one. Because, envelope filters can get really expensive.
Yeah.
You can go really $300, $400 on an envelope filter. Those were like $60.
And probably still are on used or new. Probably.
They were great.
Yeah.
The 3-knob ones especially. They had a 2-knob one previous. The 3-knob one is great.
Wow. Well, I just spent $200 talking to you today. Now I'm going to try out everything you said. Thank you very much for stopping by, man.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Bryan Peterson, the owner of GearSecure.net, offers a service actually to police officers free for them to check the database to find the owners of stolen goods. When the cops find a lot of stolen goods, they can't prosecute till they find the owners. So Bryan provided a source for these officers to try and track the owners. So when you sign up for this service, your stuff is searchable in the database. If you have a decent-sized collection, it's worth the fee to get your stuff registered. By no means is GearSecure.net paying for an ad. I thought it was a very good service, and I know that it works, so I thought I'd share it with you. Howard Daniel was very generous in the information that he shared with us. Some seemed to be very personal, and that was quite kind of him to dig that deep into his heart to share with us. And I can assure you that you will find part 2 very, very interesting as we dig deeper into the factory from the years 1958 to 1969. And you can join me every other week for a new episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's 2 really easy ways to do it. 1, give us a 5-star review and subscribe on whatever platform you listen to podcasts, or go to reverb.com and search for Everpick. Then purchase the most powerful guitar pick that you've ever laid across your strings. And if you do not agree, I will give you your money back. Me, the guy talking, will give you your money back. There has been no one in 113 purchases and 113 reviews, there has been no one who has disagreed with the statements that I've just made. Everyone uses the word amazing, impossible, yada, yada. Yes, it's not that impossible. It's not my invention. God invented it. I reinvented it and brought it back after 400 years, and now we don't have to let nylon destroy our tone. For instance, if you have an acoustic guitar and you use a nylon string, let's say you have a Martin. I know a Martin has 16 easily excitable points that will make your sound fuller and louder and go travel farther. When you strike it with the nylon string, you will not excite any more than 6 of those 16, even in the sweet spot. My pick excites 16 in the sweet spot, in the sour spot, in the side spot. You're getting 16 vibrating points on your soundboard with my pick. Give it a try. If you disagree, I'll give you your money back. You can visit us at sixstringsunder.com. And if you'd like to hear more fictitious adventures of Paul Reed Smith and Brian Wampler, well, give us a 5-star review and subscribe. Say more Paul Reed Smith and Brian Wampler. I got the next one written but not recorded, and it's funny. Peace and love worldwide. Live your life before your life lives you.
Honey, have you seen my scissors?
I borrowed them to fix the guitar here.
Oh, well, I can't find the needle I was using either.
It was around here. I think it's in the box there.
Honey, you must have dropped that needle in the guitar.
Uh-oh.
Now you'll have to take it all apart.
Just for a needle? Jiminy, we may have found a brand new sound. I think we should leave it alone, just as it is.
So long, folks.
Can you imagine looking for a needle in a guitar stack? So long, folks.